Hello, everyone. Welcome to Take Back My Brain. I am your host, Laurie Hammer, and today we're going to have a culture conversation that does greatly affect our mental health and well-being. And so I have an amazing guest with me today. Her name is Julie Behling, and she is the author of Beneath Sheep's Clothing, and she just released a documentary on Beneath Sheep's Clothing as well. And so we're going to dive into what's going on in our culture, where things are kind of going wrong and how that's affecting the mental health of our nation and just basically the well-being of our nation. So welcome, Julie. Thank you to the welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Awesome. So Beneath Sheep's Clothing, can you give the audience kind of a brief synopsis of what that book and the documentary are about?
Yeah, so it's about the communist takeover of culture as it occurred historically in the Soviet Union and parallels in America, and focusing on schools and churches and also some on the media. Um, and I'm really, really glad that you asked me to be on your show because not very many people, I mean, there are a few people out there covering this from that angle, but the mental health perspective of this culture war that's been waged on, especially young people, but I mean, not just young people, but young people can't get away from it if they're in the schools. It's really important to address this. And thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I love to have this conversation because I'm 51. And so I remember the Berlin Wall coming down, was it 1989, right? And, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. Of course, we remember that, remember where we were, when all of that happened. And I don't feel like I never really thought about communism much because that's like what happens over, in Eastern Europe and Russia and those places and not really here. And then as I've gotten older and understood more about culture and watching different things take place, and now that we have this mental health crisis on our hands in this country and how media how school plays into it, our educational processes, even the church, as you mentioned. How are we dealing with it? And I don't feel we're dealing with it very well. And I feel like there's a deeper, maybe agenda going on in the world today. And so I would love to know, how did you come to write Beneath Sheep's Clothing? Because I feel like we're kind of in that same era of, our life wasn't too bad. And then all of a sudden, we've got a lot of issues going on for our kids and our grandkids.
Yeah, so for me, it goes back to I took Russian language classes when
Oh,
I was
okay.
in college. I had like 5 semesters of Russian, and then I decided I wanted to go and be a missionary, and then I ended up getting called to go to Russia. And so I was there for a year and a half, 1997, 1998, and I mean, it was a crazy experience and very challenging, very life-changing experience. And I came across a lot of people, speaking of mental health, with really poor mental health. A lot of older people who had been deeply traumatized by
Right.
communism, by Stalin, the Stalinist regime,
Right.
and going to the Gulag and various things, which I was like, wow, the Gulag, I had never really heard of that. And here I am in Russia as a young and 22, 23-year-old meeting
Right.
people who had been in the Gulag for, a decade or more of their life. It was really shocking. And of course, seeing the poverty of the Russian people, especially at that time, that was pretty eye-opening as well. But after my mission, I went back to the US and I went to graduate school and ended up studying Russian language and literature and Russian and
Okay.
East European studies for a dual master's degree. And then I had actually met some people when I was on my mission. I had met some people who their families had been faithful Christians, like super Christians, not just like thinking about it sometimes.
Right.
Like a lot of people, that's what they were. They were Christians on the inside, but then outwardly they just kind of like went through the motions just so they would get through and not be persecuted and prosecuted.
Oh, sure.
But I did meet some dissident Christians who had been faithful, hardcore Christians throughout this, their families had throughout the Soviet era. And it
Wow.
was really amazing to meet some of these people. So when I was deciding to write a master's thesis, I decided to write my thesis on underground Christian movements in the Soviet Union. their survival tactics and the tactics of the Soviet state to try to dismantle Christianity. So I spent 2 years. I went back to Russia actually to meet people who had were part of some of these dissident churches, to meet more of them. And 2 years on the research and the writing of this. And then it was about 4 years later that I began seeing these same tactics that I had researched for my thesis happening in America. And I
Wow.
took a closer look, and like they all were there. It was very shocking to me. I took off time from my businesses to write most of my book, Beneath Sheep's Clothing, between 2009 and 2011. I
Wow.
set it aside because it was like I just couldn't put my finger on it, but I couldn't finish it.
Right. What were
Um,
the things you were seeing, Julie?
well, the main things as far as tactics for the Soviets to try to destroy Christianity, and it turns out these tactics are really important for overtaking a culture in which
Okay.
Christianity is integral, which it was in Russia.
Yeah.
Number one, you've got to have mass anti-religious propaganda
Hmm.
and mass pro-socialist or pro-communist propaganda. That means you have to own the schools. You've got the media, you've got all the arts. In fact, you could be a poet in the Soviet Union. And if your poetry didn't properly gush about communism and about the Soviet state, you could be executed. And if you
Wow.
were, if you were for sure, if you were exposing bad aspects
Hmm.
of, what was going on there, you would for sure be executed. So they had to own all of those things, get control of those things, constantly denigrate Christians, Christianity. So that's number one. Number two, in the early days of the Soviet Union, they were persecuting all Christians equally. Actually, they went after the mainstream churches first, the Russian Orthodox Church and the clergy. They mass rounded up the clergy, tortured and executed many of them, sent many of them to the Gulag, terrorized them. Then they went after all the different Christian groups. But what they realized by the end of World War II is that it was only breeding a lot of underground religious activity. So they switched their tactics. So instead of persecuting all Christians equally, they only kept their really heavy-handed tactics where they would, arrest you, send you to the gulag if you were a choir director or a pastor. They would take your kids from you and put them forcibly in state-run atheistic boarding schools in the Soviet Union. They would torture some people. They would forcibly put people in psychiatric prison hospitals and forcibly
Mhm.
treat them with psychotropic drugs to cure them of their delusions of believing in God and not gushing and falling in love with communism. Um, that was the next tactic. So persecuting the fringe groups, like really heavy-handed. And number three, it was infiltration of the churches. And with
Okay.
in the Soviet Union, they infiltrated the churches with KGB agents who posed as clergy, who would then go in and rise up in the ranks of the churches and gain control of the churches and control them from within.
Wow.
Meanwhile, they're working for the government.
Right.
So I found all those tactics happening in America, not the KGB agent part, but the infiltration of the churches with avowed communists, absolutely, began happening in America over a century ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. That's just shocking to hear, right? Because we think, well, we've
Mhm.
got such a good handle on things. We have, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and things are not as they seem, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a concerted effort for over a century that has gained more and more steam over the last few decades to the point now where people are waking up en masse. But this concerted effort to subvert America, to turn us into a socialist slash communist nation. And this is what people need to understand, and this is what is not taught in the schools, and this is not taught like you would think there would be like tons of major motion pictures about the war against communism because it's been a major theme. But no, they don't have that either. They don't want people knowing what communism is and what it does. That's another thing that my documentary is very, very sure to drive it home. What
Right.
exactly is communism? Communism? What does it do to people? How
Yeah.
does it destroy people?
Can you
All in
tell
the
us
name of
what exactly
uplifting the
is
oppressed.
communism?
What's that?
Can you tell us what exactly is communism?
Yeah.
I see it as, what you're describing, sending people to the gulags and, mass murder and stuff, but there's a lot of subtlety before that kind of stuff happens.
Yeah. If you talk to some people who are communists, they'll tell you that communism has never actually been carried out because in their mind, communism is this utopian, like, classless society, heaven on earth, where everyone, gives according to what they have to give and receives back according to their need. So it's never been achieved. But what we can say is any society attempting to implement communism, what you end up with is mass impoverishment, mass enslavement, and mass murder of the people. That's what happens every time. We're talking to the tune of, 150 million dead bodies in the 20th century alone from countries killing their own people. We're not talking about wars with other countries. You look at even like Cambodia, Pol Pot killed 25% of his own population. So you get this mass murder, and because so let's backtrack a little bit. What is socialism? Socialism is where the government owns the means of productions. Well, the people supposedly own the means of production, but the
Mm,
government will hold that in the name of the people. And and supposedly, everyone is supposed to have equal outcomes. Communism can be defined. There's lots of different definitions. The way I define it is it's the forcible implementation of socialism through a violent revolution.
gotcha.
So a big hallmark of communism is that anything and everything is justified. There's like no end to what is justified if you're doing it in the name of helping the oppressed. And so this is where you get like sociopathic, psychopathic people in charge that are like, well, we've got to kill off all these people because they're hurting the oppressed. And so we've got to like go and kill all these people. Or this group of people over here is a threat to the collective. Um, there's no such thing as individual rights under
Right.
communism. You get lots of free stuff, but very little freedom. Now, the Soviet Constitution granted, it did say that people had freedom of religion and freedom of speech, but in reality, that was absolutely not the case. But mass enslavement, mass impoverishment, and mass death, those are the fruits of communism every time a nation has tried to implement it.
Right. And so we go through socialism first. Am I understanding that correctly? A nation
Well,
leans
yeah,
towards socialism and then the communists take over.
yeah, they're kind of they're like first cousins.
Okay.
Socialism, there's different types of socialism. There's Fabian socialism, which is more of the gradual implementation of it. And then the communist variety is no, we're gonna make everyone do this with,
More of
we
a
have the
tyranny.
weapons, we'll kill the people who won't go along with it.
Right.
And but it's all in the name of helping the oppressed and the underprivileged.
Right. We're like, I feel like we're normalizing dysfunction in this country. And some of it sounds fine. When you're talking about socialism, helping the underprivileged, helping the oppressed. I mean, there's definitely groups and politicians that can make it sound like this is what we should do. We should love your neighbor, which is all very, very true and right, correct?
Right,
Um,
right.
but we just went through this political environment where one of the candidates was saying, we need to have equal outcomes. And that's a very communist mindset for sure, because there's no way that you can have equal outcomes with people and have a society that still functions. So what I even want to ask Julie, because I watched your Beneath Sheep's Clothing twice, and I'm just so disturbed by it, to be quite honest with you. So those of you listening, you really need to watch. If you don't buy the book, at least buy, the documentary on this, because um our mental health is at stake, like our society is at stake with this, because it really is infiltrating. So when I say we're normalizing dysfunction, I am seeing more mental health issues than ever before, especially like the last 8 years, last decade, right? We'll just say the last decade, because people are afraid. And we have these things coming up in society, whether it's a gender identity issue or white supremacy, racism, those kind of things. And as I've watched your documentary, it kind of opened my eyes to a few more things as to how the media, which I already knew to a certain extent, but the more I dig into this, the more mad I get, kind of propagandize those types of mindsets. And so if you don't do your research, if you don't stop and take a step back, you're going to fall into like, just because I'm white, I'm racist. Or if you're not a white person, well, then all white people are racist. And I don't believe that all people of color think that. And we're all people of color because we all have different shades. But um, to even separate a society by racial skin color, I feel like is a tactic of communism. So correct me on any of this if I'm wrong. And then what is to gain by doing all of this? Because it's going to create a society, as we've seen in history, that kills one another and the whole society collapses. So what is there to gain with this agenda?
Well, it's a power grab. The
Okay.
people at the top, I call it this, it's like a pyramid. And at the very top of the communist enabling pyramid are people who are not communists. They are actually the ones who first brought this into America were the robber barons, the Carnegies, the
Okay.
Rockefellers. They actually helped fund the communist infiltration of the
Right.
churches and the schools in America. And so you have these people that have already amassed a huge amount of power and they want more power. They want to make sure that the regular person can't just pop up and usurp their power. And so communism was found to be a nice, convenient way to keep the people in check while at the same time telling you, the people that you're helping uplift them.
Right.
You're actually delivering the opposite to them. And there might be a few people that benefit here and there, but you're keeping the masses down while at the same time making the masses believe that you're helping uplift them. Um, that's part of it. So I think it's really important to understand. So what are the foundational ideologies that America was built on? We were built on a foundation of Judeo-Christian ethics, right? The Ten Commandments ethics, not that they were always implemented perfectly by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
And then you have meritocracy and then you have natural rights, where these certain rights that every person has are inalienable. That is the foundation of the ideology that led to the most prosperous and free society that the world has ever seen. What we're
Right.
seeing, what we've been seeing now has been happening for over 100 years, really ramping up in the last 15 years or so, 10, 12 years or so, is replacing within the schools, within the media, replacing these foundational or attempting to replace these foundational ideologies with a new ideology of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Be it diversity, equity, and inclusion are communism. It's a rebranding of communism that makes it palatable to the Western
Because it
heart and
sounds good.
mind.
Everybody should have an equal opportunity.
Right. And this is where I say in my book, I think I don't know if I this part make it into the film or not. Communism marries a truth to a lie. That's how it succeeds. It takes a truth that there are some people and certain groups and certain people that have been horribly mistreated, abused, oppressed. And it validates that oppression, but then it
Mhm.
marries it to the lie of, well, we have the answer. Come with us and like we're going to have a violent revolution to tear down the systems of power. You're going to get back at all those people who have oppressed you,
Mhm.
and we're going to power grab in the process. And by the way, you'll probably be purged when we're done with you, because that's what they often do with the people that are the front, like revolutionaries that are the
Right.
most violent out there. They're the ones that are first in line to be purged, which means murdered.
Right.
Once the power is sufficiently amassed, that's what they do in every communist society. They kill their own. The ones that actually help to implement the program are the first on the chopping block once the program is instituted. Um, but this foundational ideology of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's a twisted version of diversity, because diversity, according to the woke Marxists, is you're diverse if you take on critical consciousness, meaning you believe that everything can be viewed through the single lens of oppressed versus oppressor. That every single aspect of history, every single aspect of society and culture is only to be viewed through the sole lens of oppressed versus oppressor. That's what I call the woke goggles,
Right.
that you're wearing these woke goggles where everything is racist now, everything is transphobic, everything is misogynistic. There always has to be some oppressed versus oppressor aspect to things. And the truth is that oppressed versus oppressor is real, but it messes up. You can't see the full picture if you only see everything through that soul lens.
Right,
And then when you get to equity and the diversity, equity, and inclusion, equity is explicitly equal outcomes, which is explicitly communist, because you can't have a society that is highly functional where everyone has to be exactly the same. It just
right.
doesn't work.
Well, even going biblically, the church in Jerusalem, they shared everything with each other, and they were the most impoverished church that the Bible talks about. You know,
Hmm.
I mean, I would not say that they were communists. I'm just saying equal outcome doesn't necessarily is not a good thing, even from a biblical perspective. Somebody still has to work. Somebody still has to, you know, create new things. And like you can't support everybody within an organization the same. It just doesn't work that way. Um, when reviewing things from this single lens, who determines, or how is it determined, if you can answer this, who's the oppressed and who's the oppressor?
Well, I mean, as far as the woke Marxist revolution that's been occurring in America and the West these past few decades, which is explicitly Marxist, you
Hmm.
have these academic thought leaders, and this is where you have James Lindsay, who is very extensively featured in my film Beneath Sheep's Clothing, because he's one of the top experts who has read all the literature of these woke Marxist thought leaders,
Right,
these various academics, and they've created this body of literature that now is very heavily studied in colleges. And then even also you get down to the colleges of education, according to James Lindsay, I think he said it was in 1994 that upwards, I don't want to misquote, it was a huge percent, I think it was something like 80% of the colleges of education were overtaken with woke Marxism, with communism essentially by that mid 90s.
right,
So all of these teachers that have been coming out have been taught in this way that it's not just about teaching the basics to students, it's about this Marxified education where they have to constantly be inserting this diversity, equity, and inclusion and weaving it throughout everything. And then you have the social and emotional learning, which explicitly is for re-educating America's children away from Judeo-Christian ethics
right,
and Americanism and to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And look, on the surface, it seems like it's not that big of a deal because, oh, it's almost like Christianity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? It's almost the same. No, it's the inversion of Christianity. And the people behind this, it's like, sorry, if you look at the fruits of communism, we should be running from everything communist because it is, again, mass murder, mass impoverishment, mass enslavement. And as you've seen, and many of us have seen also, mass mental health issues,
yes,
destabilization. And going back to that destabilization, that is one of the goals of these people. Obviously, it's very obvious to me to destabilize this rising generation like no other generation.
oh my gosh, yeah,
And so they are purposefully seeding them with things that will destabilize them. In fact, that is part of the Marxification of education that they're taught. And when they're teaching children and exposing them to things that will create cognitive dissonance within them, like, oh my gosh, am I racist? You know,
hmm,
a 9-year-old child is supposed to like be like checking their privilege.
right,
Um, and
yeah,
there, it's just insane.
it is insane. We were at a horse show not too long ago. My daughter, she rides, and so we were talking to a couple young girls, and one of the young girls says to me, we were talking about colors of horses. Is all we were talking about. And the girls were talking about their horses. And then the young girl looks at me, she goes, I don't want to sound racist, but my horse is black. I said, sweetheart, it's a color. Your horse can be black. It's okay to say that word, you know? But and it struck me so deeply because this is a young girl from a very small town in Iowa. And so sometimes you think in small town Iowa, things aren't quite infiltrated, but yet they are. She was afraid to say that her horse was black and that that would be something that she was saying that was racist, right? And so where did she get that from? I'm going to guess not from her parents. I'm going to guess it was from the educational system. And I will say that the church isn't doing a very good job of dispelling that as well, because here's a 12-year-old girl who thinks that it's racist if she says her horse is black. And that's just wrong. And so we're normalizing that dysfunction again. So this is not okay. And so she could tell in her spirit that she was genuinely concerned to say that. And so
Right.
as you're talking, it's the indoctrination where you're so guarded about everything that you're going to say instead of having an actual real conversation over things. If you don't go along with the mainstream thought pattern, then you are one of those people that they would probably send to the gulag in, communist Russia. So,
Yeah,
it,
it's really disturbing. I mean, once a person has seen the pattern of what communists do and how they do it, and then you can see that happening in America, then it's like this aha moment.
yeah,
But until then, it's really easy because the communists employ something called mystification, and they're
okay, talk about
really good at it. That makes it really hard to understand what they're doing because parts of it are so true, and
it.
there's good things that are being said, and it's mixed in with this horrible lie. And so we have to go back to what was working before. What was working before when you and I were coming of age is we watched Mr. Rogers. We watched Sesame Street, and back then Sesame Street wasn't communist, at least not overtly so. Like we saw kids of all different races that played together just fine. I went to schools with kids of all races. I didn't grow up in Utah where I
You
currently
didn't
live.
think anything of it.
No, I grew up in Southern California and
Hmm.
Texas and Florida. I was around all different kinds of people, and it was not cool to be racist
No,
in like the 80s and 90s. And I did go to college in the deep South in Tallahassee, Florida, and I did meet some real racist people, I have to admit.
right.
It was freaked me out too. It
Hmm.
completely freaked me out. So racism, of course, was not dead, but it was not cool,
Hmm.
and it was considered, it was just not cool. And most people had friends of different races, and it was not a big deal. And it was going back to that of where we're not judging people, we're not hyper focused on race all the time, that was what was working.
Hmm.
So all this new stuff that's been implemented, the critical race theory, creates more racism, it creates more dysfunction, it creates more division, and it makes the people more easy to be controlled
Right.
by the puppet masters.
Well, it creates more victims. So if you hear the narrative all the time that, there's misogyny, there's racism, there's white privilege, there's this, there's that. And then so if you feel like you've had any of those things happen, then you are a victim. And what does a victim do? A victim becomes really stagnant, and I see that in my practice, people who literally they've had really bad things happen to them, right? And then you add on top of this, this agenda, this narrative, that we have in our world today, it's hard for people to break out of that, right? And so,
Sure.
especially the younger generation, there's a lot more mental health issues going on right now, and we seem to be okay with them. We seem to let, young people own their anxiety. Like just everybody has anxiety, everybody has depression, and it's because of you name it. And so then they can name it as to why they have it instead of how can I overcome this? How can I, give myself the right nutrition or give myself, the right opportunity, the right friend group, the right everything, how do I, get out of this instead of staying in it? We sort of start owning all this dysfunction when it's not healthy. And I see all these kids, especially, with all these gender identity issues and stuff, there's some really hurty kids. And it's not if you don't agree with the gender fluidity and those kind of things, you're labeled, transphobic or racist or whatever it might be. And it's just my heart breaks for them because it's not normal. It's not okay. And they actually need some help. And so when you say those things, doesn't mean you're against gays or lesbians or any of those things. You just see people who are hurting in their mental health, and it's very obvious that they are. And we've normalized it and decided that it's okay. And we just leave those people the way that they are. And if we are to go into communism, sadly, some of those people, as you're saying, will be the first to to go, or however you want to put it, in those types of regimes, because that is how it has historically happened. Those people are not welcome in communist societies in the long term.
No, that it's just a tactic to destabilize. And also, along with the whole transing of the kids and the queering
Yeah.
of the kids, is the hypersexualization of
Yeah.
the kid. And what shocked me when I found out about this through again back to James Lindsay, some of his content, this was actually first attempted in Hungary when they were attempting to shove communism through in the 1920s.
Interesting.
And this guy, Georgi Lukács was his name. And he's like, well, we've got to go in the schools and we've got to give like really explicit sexuality education,
Hmm.
like really over the top, explicit, hypersexualizing education. What happened in the 1920s in Hungary at that time is the people rejected it and they ousted him and they kicked those people out. They
Uh-huh.
later on they ended up with communism later on because of everything with the Soviet Union. But at least in that instance, they stood up to it. But they did find that you can destabilize.
Hmm.
It would be one way to destabilize a society was to get the kids destabilized with hypersexual urges and exposing them to way too much sexual
Yeah.
content that's not age appropriate. If you can destabilize their gender identity, my goodness, what can you
Right.
can do just about anything
Right.
with.
You can do just about anything then. I know we started homeschooling when my son, he just completed first grade. And so we started homeschooling. So this is our 18th year. And I've never looked back on it. And, but one of the things that was kind of our deciding factor, and, some of the people listening be like, Lori, that really wasn't a big deal. But if you take a step back and look at it, it is a big deal. So as you talk about the infiltration of everything, it's not like we had a horrible experience with the public school system. We didn't. But in our spirits, we just like we need to start homeschooling, and there really wasn't any reason not to, right? And one of the things was they're supposed to send you home with a information sheet, and you're supposed to sign it, say yes, my kid can watch the stranger danger videos, all those kind of things. Well, we didn't get that, right? And I don't think it was a malicious act from the teacher or anything like that, but they just didn't send it out, right? So came home and he's like, they talked about stranger danger and they also talked about inappropriate touching and those kind of things. That is no place in the school system. And so there's like one of the things. So if they're going to talk about that, what are they going to talk about next year and the next year and the next year? And so I could see it snowballing because those were questions that I didn't need to answer for my son at that point in time because he was in first grade and it's not a topic that was appropriate at the moment. And so the school should not have been having it either. And they didn't have any parents in the classroom as a witness to what was being talked about as well, because you don't know what any other little kid's going to say, like, Uncle whoever touched me wrong. And so then all of a sudden, all these kids know something that happened, right? So a lot of issues there. And so we started, wasn't the final decision, but it was a piece of why we homeschooled. But my point in saying that is, um, it, I have so many people over the years say to me, well, when the school system gets bad enough, then we'll homeschool. And so when do you decide that it's bad enough? Because if it's such a subtle infiltration, Julie, how do parents become more aware of things? Because I'm looking at, my homeschool friends and my public school friends who have their kids, in the public school system, and my heart actually breaks for them. And I'm thinking, I wonder why they're not taking them out because this is what I'm seeing. And but they're still in the system. Like, well, it's not that bad. We still live in a small school. We have a good church. And, what do you say to those people? And how do you help them to expand their vision?
I mean, first of all, I understand like our whole society, our whole culture is built around the idea of sending kids to school when they're
Yes.
5.
Yes, it
And
is.
then
Which
the
needs to
parent,
change. It does. It really just
yeah,
needs to change.
our whole culture is built on that. And then you have a lot of people with situations that make it extra hard for them. Let's
Yes.
say both parents have to work to be able to pay the bills. Let's say single parent, I'm a single mom, who homeschools my 10-year-old, and I guarantee that it's not always easy.
Not easy.
Um, and there's different situations, finances, not enough support. I mean, I this is where I'm hoping that people in their local areas can start co-ops, can start mini schools and various other alternative schooling things that will allow people to pull their kids out who maybe would not be able to homeschool. But I will say this about homeschool, it takes a couple of hours a day, maybe 4 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, maybe more when they're older. Well, my son at this point, like he's in another room right now and he's 10 years old and he's actually extremely gifted with electronics and like engineering. He's actually listening to a Udemy course on electronic engineering right
Right.
now.
Mm-hmm.
And so he does a lot of unschooling kind of activities on his own. But in terms of
Yep.
my time with him each week, it's a couple hours a day, about four days a week. And
Yeah.
then there's different homeschool activities and groups and various other things that he's involved in and that kids can be involved in most areas. There's a lot more resources now. Look, there's so many amazing curricula out there. There's tons of stuff for free, and like YouTube is a wealth. There's all kinds of
My
great
goodness, there's so
videos.
much information. Yes.
I mean, a person could homeschool with YouTube in the public library, and you can go really far even just with those two free
Oh, a
resources.
100%. Yeah. It doesn't really have to cost you pretty much anything to homeschool now.
Yeah, I mean, where I live in Utah, we actually have programs that give funding for homeschoolers if
Oh,
we just
nice.
have to
Hmm.
report, like a quarterly review or whatever. And so I actually get funding in that way. But even if I didn't, it would still, there's ways to do it. It's not expensive. Like they're spending, I think I saw it, it's costing $16,000 per school year per student
Hmm.
to be in the public school system, which is insane.
Yeah. It is insane. Yeah. And we don't spend $1,600 a year homeschooling.
Yeah.
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 Curriculum or anything.
16,000.
Yeah. No.
And they make us believe that we have to have all these high-tech bells and whistles. The high-tech bells and whistles are causing a lot of the problems because
Exactly.
the dark curricula, grooming of the kids to go into the DEI to change their ideological foundation, that's all embedded into all of that.
Hmm.
And it's also making it so the kids are not developing true critical thinking. If all of their doing now, look, we use YouTube videos as a supplement, and my son's math curriculum has like 10-minute math lesson videos. So
Hmm.
we use videos, but when it's nonstop and that's all that there is, and there's
Yeah.
not any writing by hand, and there's not reading of actual books, that's very lopsided and imbalanced.
Oh, yes.
That could be
100%.
a whole conversation in and of itself. I mean, I would tell people they need to watch Beneath Sheep's Clothing
Mhm.
and and then take a look at whether they want to keep their kids in the schools because there's lots of reasons where we can be like, oh, but my child's extracurricular activity, oh, but there's this, oh, but there's that. There are other options, I promise you.
Are.
Like I'm a little bit lucky again in Utah. They have to allow homeschoolers to do the different extracurriculars with the public school kids, the sports and the music, which is great. But even I've seen like, you know, people starting up orchestras and starting up different sports groups and sports leagues of homeschool kids in different areas. There's so many people who have put together so many resources.
Yeah. You just have to start talking to other parents and say, hey, would you ever be interested in doing this?
Yeah.
And we've done, different homeschool co-ops. My daughter was involved in volleyball. My son did some basketball. I mean, with homeschool groups, and we did speech and debate. We traveled the country. We've, done so many different things. There's lots and lots of resources out there. So getting the kids out of the public school system, there are plenty of options for you, definitely. And I know there's some, I'm on my last. This is my daughter's 18, and so she's a senior this year. And so some, parents have said, gosh, I wish there was a co-op in our area now because there used to be and now there's not. And so there are definitely people who are hungry for that. It's just start talking with each other. Because if we're not in the system, then the system can't control you, right?
Yeah. And I mean, another thing that's helped me because and I mentioned this in my documentary, I actually had a really good public school experience. I had a above average and I had a lot of great teachers. I mean, I had some bad ones too, but
Yeah.
I've actually been like, well, but look, what if I had, because I had entrepreneurial tendencies from the time I was a child. I didn't actually start doing anything with it in my life until I was in my 30s.
Oh, me too.
No one had ever shown me anything. I would like naturally try to start a little business and do little
Mhm.
things when I was a kid. Well, my son has those same tendencies, but I'm an entrepreneur. So now he's built himself his whole website. He is he's going and setting up a booth where the school bus is dropping kids off and selling crystals and rocks. He's like interested in semi-precious stones
That's awesome.
and various other things. We gathered a whole bunch of pecans from a tree at the park, and he was selling pecans. And so he has the opportunity to actually do more of that than he would if he
Yeah,
were in school. And there's all kinds of kids entrepreneurial markets and
yeah.
like farmers markets that are people set up. There's all kinds of, just think back, like I don't know, like I've like reimagined like what would my experience have
Mhm.
been as an entrepreneur if I had been able to have opportunities like this when I was a kid.
Yeah,
And so some of the good things I had when I was in public school, yeah, my son might not have those, but what are other opportunities
that are
is he
even better. Yeah. That he can
even
take
better?
with him, that he doesn't have that limiting belief that you and I have had to overcome, as we've gotten older. Um, and and I want to make clear that we're not saying that the teachers and stuff are communists. We're not saying any of that. It is very top down when it comes to the curriculum. And like we were talking, it's very subtle, the things that happen. Um, where did communism start, Julie?
Where did it start?
Where did it start? I mean, it's been around, I mean, since really almost the beginning of time. But is there a specific group that they can trace it back to?
Well, I mean, I'll just go back to Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto. I
Hmm.
mean, I have not researched all the ins and outs. I know people will talk about other strains of it. Um, And then once you delve into Karl Marx, there's like lots of other rabbit holes that open up where apparently he had like connections with dark secret societies and various other things. But I have not personally researched that in depth. But Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, and then it started spreading in different parts of the world. It did really well. Marxism did really well in Russia, and there were just different strains of people who picked it up. Um, I have not researched that aspect of things as fully as other people have, but in my documentary, I did interview Alex Newman, who talked
Right,
about the origins. He talks about the very origins of America's public school system was from someone who was a communist
right.
and in America, and
And it's
that
all,
was shocking
thank
to
God.
me.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was shocking for me to learn about that. I learned about that while I was interviewing him for the film. I'm like, oh my gosh. So, but to create and it was first started in America. Americans weren't interested, so this guy peddled his stuff to the King of Prussia. And so the whole Prussian school system, which is where we got the Nazi Germany,
Right,
the kids were all very indoctrinated in the schools and very much taught to follow the system. Um, that's how one of the reasons why we got Nazi Germany. When the government takes charge of the schooling, and inserts their ideology into that, that's just a huge recipe for disaster.
right,
And it happens, and it happened rampantly throughout the 20th century. And now again, I make this case in my film and my book. We're in the end stages of a communist revolution, a cultural revolution in America. And thankfully, we're seeing signs of enough people waking up and pushing back. But I have to warn people that look, if we'd gotten Kamala Harris as president, like she actually was a communist. That's a whole other thing.
whole
My
other
friend
thing.
Trevor
Right,
Loudon, who I interviewed for my film, he actually wrote a book, Stealth, where he details her family and her communist origin.
well,
She was funded by a communist. Her entire political career was funded by a communist. So if we had had that as president, I mean, I would be very, very not as optimistic. I'm more optimistic now. However, it's still going to take millions of us at the bottom here in America to extricate first understand how Marxism has infiltrated the schools and
right,
the culture, and then to extricate it out. And that's just one aspect of things. Then you go into the ESG and like how it's infiltrated the businesses with all this ESG business of
right,
forcing the businesses to also push DEI and the woke Marxist crap. Um, that's that's a whole other thing that has to be addressed.
right, right. Can you address how it's infiltrated the churches here in America?
Yeah, I mean, starting at the beginning of the 20th century, again, we had John D. Rockefeller, who was literally funding and bankrolling avowed communists to go in and to become teachers at some of these seminaries.
Hmm.
And what these communist seminary teachers started doing is they started demythologizing the Bible. They started demythologizing Jesus. And we even had people who were in high levels of leadership in some of these churches who didn't even believe that Jesus is the Son of God.
Right.
And yet they're like this high level Presbyterian pastor who's like teaching many others in the seminary. Very, very strange.
Yeah.
Um, Demythologizing the Bible and then pushing the church away from what the true kernel of Christianity, as far as I understand it, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong. It is an individual relationship with God and
Hmm.
an individual come to Jesus moment where we recognize that we need help. We go to Jesus, we ask him to we repent of our sins, we ask him to redeem us, and we have an individual redemption where we can go back into the presence of God. And then even before we die, we can be born again and we can have this new life where, and it's again through our individual connection with God.
Right.
Well, that was it with this communist takeover of Christianity in America. They had to kind of push that off to the side and refashion Christianity to be all about social justice.
Right.
And so, and it was easy to do because helping and serving the poor is absolutely part of
Part of
Christianity.
Christianity. Yeah.
So, but they're taking it away from the individual redemption. And even to the point where you had some of these early thought leaders, these were very influential people, talking about Jesus didn't come to die for the sins of man. He came to die for the 6 sins of social injustice, to reframe Jesus into a communist revolutionary. And that
Right.
this was done through the National Council of Churches, which roughly half of America's mainline Christian denominations belong to. They were they were the most infiltrated, but evangelical movements have been infiltrated from the top down. There's no
Yep.
major church that is not infiltrated with this. And it's some of them much worse than others. But we need to either, I mean, people need to watch the film, people or read the book. And sorry, I don't know where else are they're the best sources of to get all this information. But we need to either stop attending those heavily subverted churches, go find churches that are not heavily subverted, or do your own home worship like you do homeschool and maybe gather some families. I mean, we don't want to I want people to attend church, but
Mhm.
not the heavily subverted churches where they're just going to be, pushed further into the
Right.
crazy land.
A lot of guilt and a lot of condemnation that is used to get people to, it's heart-wrenching, right? So you tell all these stories, these social stories, this and that, and people are like, oh yeah, that really needs to be fixed, and it does, right? And then there's a deeper agenda after that. So I really appreciate you, Julie. This has been a great conversation. Everybody go out and watch and purchase Beneath Sheep's Clothing. And where can they find that, Julie?
Yeah, go to beneathsheepsclothing.movie and you can grab it there. We also have it on DVD and we have subtitles in English, Spanish, and Portuguese.
Wow.
And I hope, we've gotten great reviews from it,
Mhm.
really great reviews. I will also tell people it's not a film for young children. Um, I would say 16 and up, and then maybe if people have really mature younger teenagers, it's really heavy content, not for little kids. And but other than that, I mean, people should be showing this to their churches. You can actually buy tickets to be able to show it to a large group. We've had people do that. There's a way for people to also be able to
Okay.
show it in a local theater and set up theater
Really?
screening.
That would
Mhm.
be amazing. I'll talk to you about that when we're done here.
Okay.
Awesome.
Yeah. Beneathsheepsclothing.movie.
Awesome. Anything that you want to, final words to say to the audience?
Yeah, I mean, the film and the book expose the problems, and now we're working on more solutions for people.
Awesome.
At peoplesnetwork.us, we're putting together actually something I'm really excited about, some content that I can't spill the beans yet, but a way that I think it could be a really positive way to help high school and college age kids to be deprogrammed from all the woke Marxism and to really see it for what it is and in a way that's also fun and in a social environment. So we're working on that as well.
Okay. Well, I can't wait to see what that is. And
Mhm.
thank you for being here. I appreciate you
Thanks so
very
much.
much. And thank you
Absolutely.
everyone for listening. Go buy Beneath Sheep's Clothing, and I will see you in the next episode.